Stacey Abrams wants not to expect a U.S. presidential winner on election night. This is according to Reuters News. Voting rights advocate Stacey Abrams warned Americans on Tuesday not to expect to learn the winner of the White House on election night, November 3rd, as problems delivering and counting an expected flood of mail-in ballots prompted by the coronavirus pandemic could delay the result and draw a flurry of legal challenges. I quote, "The sheer volume of people who will be voting by May is going to preclude the ability to count those ballots and adjudicate the outcome of the election by 11 p.m. on election night," Abrams, a Democrat and former leader in Georgia state legislature, said in a virtual Reuters news maker event. The public health crisis has drawn litigation in dozens of states from both major parties, that is, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Democrats and voting rights groups have pushed voting by May as a safer option to cast ballots during the pandemic, while President Donald Trump and his allies have proclaimed without evidence that expanded the voting by May will lead to widespread fraud. Is it without evidence? The recent primary elections that was held in New Jersey, people were indicted with fraud related to mail-in voting. So you cannot say it is without evidence. Abrams, once considered a possible running mate for Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden, said cost in postal service overtime imposed by Louis DeJoy, a new Trump-appointed Postmaster General, may cause delays in service as voting by May ramps up. A quote, "And so, my admonition is that we have to approach November 3rd with patience," Abrams said. A postal service postman said last week the agency was taking steps to increase operational efficiency and ensure prompt and reliable service. Several primaries this year experienced log delays in counting and naming winners because of the mail-in ballots. Ballots from New York's June 23rd primary are still being counted in some undecided races, including the congressional contest. Abrams said states hurt by the economic collapse lack the resources to handle a deluge of mail-in ballots and are going to need to determine whose ballot should be questioned and who needs to provide additional information. I quote, "But we also can't ignore that the president has put in place a Postmaster General who is slowing down the essential delivery of mail. We know that is going to lead to a number of legal challenges," Abrams said. Abrams, who is 46 years old, gained national prominence after narrowly losing her 2018 bid in Georgia to become the country's first black female governor. She accused Republican opponent Brian Kemp of voter suppression after he refused to resign as the state's top election officer while campaigning for governorship. Abrams, who later formed the voting rights group, which is known as Fair Fight, called on Trump and other Republicans to fund more than $3 billion in assistance to state election officials in the coronavirus relief bill being negotiated in the U.S. Senate. Trump, who traced Biden in opinion polls, has raised a series of questions about the integrity of the election. Last week, he suggested delaying the election due to the likelihood of fraud, though he does not have the authority to do so. Yes, he suggested. It was not a suggestion. It was a question. It was a question. Of course, every sane and rational person knows that mail-in voting is more susceptible to fraud. He also talks about voter suppression. He mentioned that voter suppression is the issue. Election experts say voter fraud of any kind, including incidents relating to mail-in ballots, is extremely rare. I believe this is the first time U.S. is going to do universal mail-in voting. There is a difference between absentee ballot and mail-in voting. There's a difference. Voter fraud is not the issue, according to her. Voter suppression is the issue, Abrams said. She said the election fund would help state officials deal with an expected crush of many ballots, as well as provide adequate polling sites for in-person election day voting to resolve some of the problems seen in recent primaries in Wisconsin, Georgia, and elsewhere. I quote, "The United States knows how to run an election. We just have to agree to do it properly," she said. "Our bottom line is we have to have a full toolbox of methods of voting. Asked whether she had been interviewed by the Biden campaign as a potential running mate, Abrams declined to comment, referring questions on the process to the campaign, but she said she feels qualified for the job and will serve if Biden asks her. Her chances at the spot have faded in recent months as other candidates emerge as more likely selection, according to conversation with Democratic officials and Biden allies. Biden is expected to announce his running mates next week, ahead of the Democratic National Convention. Abrams said black voters were motivated to defeat Trump in November. They became a focus in the campaign after the racial and social justice protests in American streets sparked by the death of George Floyd, a black man under the knee of a white police officer. The first dip in black voter turnout in 20 years contributed to Democrat Hillary Clinton's offset loss to Trump 4 years ago. I quote, "Even if people don't necessarily feel enthusiastic about the person that is Joe Biden, they are enthusiastic about the policy that are Joe Biden, and that is what I think is going to matter in November," Abrams said. So you just listen to her yourself.
But we also have to remember that there's a very distinct difference between fraud and suppression. Fraud is an intent by a voter to pretend to be more than one person or to somehow rig the system. Voter fraud is almost incalculably rare in the United States. The Heritage Foundation, which is the arbiter of how many conservative cases of fraud they can find, at best says 1,300 out of 625 million votes cast. And so fraud is not a challenge in the United States. And the two cases, or the two most recent points of evidence, New Jersey and North Carolina, those were election fraud actions, not ones done by voters, but done by people who are trying to rig the elections outside of a voter's intent. And so let's be very clear, voter fraud is not the issue. Voter suppression is the issue. And voter suppression exists across this country. And unfortunately, we're running into groups that are led by the Republican National Committee and the Trump administration, who are in the Trump campaign, who are doing their best to actually limit who has access to the ballot. In a representative democracy, when you try to cut off citizens from being able to access their vote, you are constraining and, in fact, working against the intent of the.
Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so that you'll be notified when next I upload a new video. You can also share with your friends. Thank you.